In the creche halls of the Suun, where the young are raised in great warm pools beneath the singing lamps, there is a story the brood mothers tell to frighten the small ones into stillness. Every child of the pelagic dominion has heard it. It is older than the dominion itself, older than the reckoning, older than the songs that map the deep currents between the stars. The brood mothers tell it in the low register, the one that travels through the water and into the bones, and they tell it like this. Long ago, before we counted time, there was a people made of land and breath. They did not swim, they walked. They did not sing, they screamed. They came from a world of poison air and crushing light, and they were so terrible that the old powers themselves grew afraid and cast them out beyond the edge of the maps, into the dark where nothing returns. And there they ended, for nothing survives beyond the edge. But the brood mothers say, "Be still, little one. Be quiet in the water." For the land people did not die afraid. They died promising to come back. And on the day the deep goes silent and the singing lamps flicker, that is the day the walkers return. It is a nursery story. That is all it ever was for 9,000 years. The Suun are not a foolish people. They are perhaps the wisest in the local arm, a civilization of water and patience and song, and they knew the difference between a thing the brood mothers said and a thing that was real. The walkers were a fable. A useful one, it kept the small ones from drifting too far from the warm pools, but a fable. Every Suun scholar agreed. There was no land people. There had never been a land people. The very idea was a contradiction, a creature of air and dry light, surviving the cold and the dark and the long crushing pressure of the deep between worlds. Impossible. The brood mothers themselves did not believe it. They told it the way all peoples tell the old frightening stories, as a comfort dressed up as a fear, a way of saying the dark is not empty, but it cannot reach you here. So you must understand the Suun not as fools, but as a people who had simply, reasonably, over 9,000 years, filed a thing under myth and stopped thinking about it. And you must understand that what I am about to tell you is the account of the year the file was opened, and what was inside it, and how a children's story turned out to be the only true history the Suun possessed, and the only warning they had ever been given, ignored because it had been wrapped in the voice of a brood mother soothing a child to sleep. I tell it now from two places at once, because that is the only honest way to tell it. I tell it from the deep, from inside the song and the water, from the perspective of a people who believed they were alone at the top of creation. And I tell it from the dark beyond the edge of the maps, where something had been waiting 9,000 years for the singing lamps to flicker. The two threads do not meet until the end. When they meet, the story is over, and so was the world the Suun had known. Begin in the deep. The Suun lived in the seas of 40 worlds, ocean moons and water planets strung across a quiet region of the arm that they called the cradle. They were not warlike. They had fought in their long history exactly 3 wars, all of them brief and all of them grieved for centuries afterward, because the Suun felt killing the way other species felt drowning, as a thing wholly against their nature, a violation of the deep law that all who sing are kin. Their civilization was built on song, not metaphorically. The Suun navigated by song, built by song, remembered by song. Their entire history was an unbroken cord passed mouth to mouth across 9,000 years, and every Suun could, if asked, sing their own ancestry back to the reckoning when the first pools were warmed. They had no written records because they needed none. They were a living library, and the library sang, and the song had never once in 9,000 years been interrupted. Their leader at the time of which I speak was an elder singer named Vessine, third of her name, a being of immense age and gentleness who had spent 400 years memorizing the deep currents, and was, by the reckoning of her people, the closest thing the Suun had to a living conscience. It was Vessine who first noticed that something was wrong, and it was Vessine who made the decision that doomed and saved her people in the same breath, and it is from her recovered song. The Suun preserve everything in song, even their catastrophes, that much of this account is drawn. What Vessine noticed was a silence. The Suun, you must understand, were never truly alone in the dark. The deep between the stars was full of song to them, the long, slow harmonics of distant Suun colonies, the navigational chords that crossed the cradle like currents, the great background hum of a civilization that never stopped singing. To a Suun, the universe was loud, in the way a coral reef is loud, a constant living chorus. And on a day Vessine would sing about for the rest of her life, one voice in that chorus stopped. A colony at the edge of the cradle, a small ocean moon called Thren, simply went quiet. Not a cry, not a warning, just silence where there had been song. The Suun had no concept of an attack from outside. In 9,000 years, nothing had ever come from beyond the cradle, because beyond the cradle was the edge of the maps, and beyond the edge was the dark where nothing returned. So Vessine did not think enemy. She thought grief, some natural disaster, a sickness, a failing of the warm pools. She sent singers to Thren to mourn and to help. The singers reached Thren and found the warm pools cold and empty and the colony gone, not destroyed but gone, every Suun simply absent, and they sang back to Vessine the thing they found in the silence, the one thing that did not belong, the only mark left on the dead colony. On the floor of the largest pool, etched into the rock by something that could etch rock, was a shape, not a Suun shape. The singers did not have a name for it, and they sang it to Vessine as best they could, a description in the low register. And when Vessine received the song, she went still in the water for a long time, because she knew the shape. Every Suun knew the shape. The brood mothers carved it into the walls of the creche halls to frighten the small ones. It was a walker, upright, 2 legs, 2 arms, a creature of land and breath, the shape from the nursery story etched into the floor of a dead colony at the edge of the maps on the day the deep first went silent. Now cross to the dark. Leave the warm pools and the singing and go out, past the edge of the cradle, past the edge of the maps, into the cold the Suun believed was empty. It was not empty. It had not been empty for 9,000 years. I will tell you the truth, the Suun's nursery story had wrapped around a kernel of fact and then buried under 9,000 years of soothing. There had been a land people. The story was right about that, and right about more than the Suun could have guessed. 9,000 years before, in the deep history that the Suun had compressed into a single frightening verse, the ancestors of the Suun had not been the gentle singers of 40 peaceful worlds. They had been something else. The reckoning that every Suun child sang about, the warming of the first pools, the beginning of all their history, it had a darker name in the dark beyond the maps. Out there, it was not called the reckoning. It was called the casting out. Because the land people had been real and they had not come from beyond the edge. They had come from inside the cradle. They had been there first. Here is the history the Suun had sung away. 9,000 years before, the cradle had held 2 peoples, the water-dwelling ancestors of the Suun, and a land-dwelling people who lived on the dry continents of the same worlds, breathing air, walking, building, screaming as the story said, because the Suun had never understood that screaming was only how the land people sang. For a long age the 2 peoples had shared the cradle, warily, the way 2 kinds of life share a single coast. And then there had been a war, the kind of war the Suun could not bear to remember and so had not remembered, had instead transmuted into a fable about monsters cast out by the old powers. There had been a war, and the water people had won it, and they had not merely defeated the land people. They had cast them out. Loaded the survivors of an entire species into the first vessels ever built in the cradle and flung them beyond the edge of the maps, into the dark to die. And then, over 9,000 years, the victors had slowly, deliberately, lovingly forgotten, singing the deed smaller and smaller until it fit into a single verse a brood mother could use to quiet a child. They did not swim, they walked. They did not sing, they screamed. The old powers grew afraid and cast them out. The Suun were the old powers. The Suun had cast them out, and the Suun had forgotten so thoroughly that they no longer knew the monster in the story wore their own ancient face. But the land people had not forgotten. You do not forget the day your entire species is loaded into the dark to die. They had carried it. Out beyond the edge of the maps, against every expectation, against the certainty of the Suun that nothing survives the dark, they had survived. Because the thing the Suun never understood about the people they cast out was the same thing that had made them so terrible in the war the Suun could not remember. The land people did not need a warm pool. They did not need a gentle world. They had been forged on dry continents of poison air and crushing light, and the cold dark between the stars, which would have killed a Suun in an hour, was to them merely another harsh place to refuse to die in. They had been built by their brutal homeworlds for exactly one thing, surviving conditions that should not be survivable. And the Suun had taken that people and thrown them into the most unsurvivable place there was. And the land people had looked at the cold and the dark and the 9,000 years of nothing. And they had done the only thing their nature knew how to do. They had endured, and they had remembered, and they had built. For 9,000 years in the dark beyond the maps, the cast-out people had multiplied across cold rogue worlds and lightless drifting moons, in places no Suun could have lived a single day, and everywhere they went they carried two things: the memory of the casting out, sung from parent to child in their own screaming song that the Suun would have found unbearable, and a single promise, made by the first exiles in the first vessels as the cradle shrank behind them: we will go back, not soon. The dark was vast and they were few and broken. But the land people measured time differently than the Suun. They had always been a people of the long grudge and the longer patience, and a promise made over a dying world does not expire merely because the people who made it are dust. It is sung forward. It becomes the spine of a civilization. And out in the dark, across 9,000 years, the cast-out people built their entire existence around a single sentence that every child of theirs learned before it could walk: the cradle is ours, and we are going home. They did not build a civilization of song. They built a civilization of return. Every ship, every cold colony, every generation pointed back toward the edge of the maps, waiting not for strength, because they had been strong enough for centuries, but for a thing harder to wait for. They waited until they were sure. The land people had been cast out by a people who forgot them, and somewhere in the 9,000 years their promise had grown a second clause, a darker one, born of having been erased from history by the very people who'd erased them. They would not return as a rumor. They would not return as a raid the Suun could sing away into another fable. When they came back, they would come back so completely, in such overwhelming and undeniable force, that the Suun could never again pretend the land people had been a myth. They would make themselves unforgettable. That was the whole shape of their 9,000-year patience. They were not waiting to win. They had been able to win for a long time. They were waiting to be believed. And the silence at Thren, the cold pool, the walker shape etched into the rock, that was the scouts. The first of them, confirming after 9,000 years that the cradle was still there, still full of the people who had cast them out, still singing, still soft, confirming that it was time. Now let the two threads run toward each other, because they are about to meet. In the deep, Elder-Singer Vessine made her decision. She did not at first believe the impossible thing the carved shape was telling her, that the nursery story was real, that the walkers had come back. No reasonable person would have. But Vessine was old, and she had spent 400 years learning to listen to the deep, and she did a thing no Suun scholar had done in 9,000 years. She went down into the oldest songs. The Suun's history was an unbroken chord, every verse preserved, but the oldest verses, the ones from before the reckoning, were sung so rarely and in such an archaic register that almost no living Suun could parse them anymore. They were sung at ceremonies as pure sound, their meaning lost, the way a people will keep singing a hymn long after they have forgotten the language of its words. Vessine took those oldest verses, the ones that came just before the bright triumphant reckoning song, and she did something close to blasphemy. She slowed them down. She listened to the dead language underneath the ceremony. And there, in the verses just before the reckoning, in the part of their own history the Suun sang every year and no longer understood, Vessine found the casting out, not as the brood mothers told it, as it had been. She found the war the Suun could not remember. She found the loading of a broken people into vessels. She found the dark and the throwing away, and this is the part that broke her, the part she sang about afterward with a grief that changed the register of Suun music forever. She found, at the very end of the oldest verse, a line her people had been singing meaninglessly for 9,000 years at every ceremony of remembrance, a line everyone knew by sound and no one knew by meaning. Translated, slowed, finally understood, it said, "And they went into the dark promising to return, and we sang it small so our children would not be afraid, and so that we would not have to be ashamed." The nursery story was not a fable that happened to resemble history. It was the history. The Suun had encoded the truth of their greatest crime directly into the warning they gave their children, and then forgotten how to read their own warning. The brood mothers, soothing the small ones for 9,000 years, "Be still, the walkers will return," had been reciting, without knowing it, the single most important true fact in the entire Suun civilization. The myth had been the message. And no one had listened, because who listens to a brood mother's bedtime fear as though it were a fleet report? Vessine listened. Too late, but she listened. And she understood, alone in the deep with the slowed-down truth, three things in quick and terrible succession: that her people had committed a genocide and sung it into a lullaby, that the victims had survived, and that they were coming back, and that the Suun, gentle, peaceful, song-built Suun, who had fought 3 wars in 9,000 years and grieved each one for centuries, had no defense, no doctrine, no concept even of the kind of force that was about to arrive, because they had spent 9,000 years becoming the soft and lovely opposite of the harsh thing they had once been, the harsh thing they had cast into the dark, the harsh thing that had spent those same 9,000 years getting harder. She did the only thing a singer can do. She sang the truth to all 40 worlds, not the comforting version, the true one. She broke the 9,000-year chord, interrupted the unbroken song for the first time in her people's history, to tell every living Suun what their ancestors had done, and what was now returning to answer for it. It was the bravest and most ruinous thing any Elder-Singer had ever done, because the Suun had built their entire civilization on the unbrokenness of the song, and Vessine broke it to tell them the song had been a lie at its root. Some of her people could not bear it. Some refused to believe. But Vessine sang it anyway across the cradle in the slowed-down dead language so that none could mistake it. "We are the old powers of the story. We cast them out. They are real. They are coming. And we owe them this, at least, that this time we will not pretend they were a myth." And then the singing lamps flickered. The Armada did not arrive the way an Armada arrives in a war song over the horizon, with warning, with time to gather. It arrived the way the dark itself arrives when you put out a light. One moment the edge of the cradle was empty, the boundary the Suun had trusted for 9,000 years, the line beyond which nothing returned. The next moment the edge of the maps was gone, not breached but erased, because there were so many ships filling it that there was no longer an edge, no longer a beyond, only the land people, in a number the Suun had no song large enough to hold. The cast-out had not come as a fleet. They had come as a horizon, every vessel of a 9,000-year civilization built entirely around this single arrival, the whole exiled species moving as one body toward the worlds that had thrown them away, in such overwhelming and total and undeniable force that the thing they had waited 9,000 years to guarantee was accomplished in the first instant of their appearance, before a single shot, before a single word. They could never again be called a myth. That was the victory the land people had actually crossed 9,000 years of dark to win. Not the conquest. The conquest was never in doubt. A people forged to survive the unsurvivable, arriving in total force against a civilization that grieved every death for centuries, was not a war but a foregone conclusion. The victory was the seeing. The Suun looked up from their warm pools and saw, filling the whole sky of 40 worlds, the people they had erased from their own history, returned in a form too vast to forget. And in that moment the nursery story died and became fact in the mind of every Suun alive, the file-marked myth torn open forever, and the land people who had wanted, above all else for 9,000 years, simply to be believed, were, at last, believed. What happened after, I will tell you quickly, because the slow part of this story was the 9,000 years, and the fast part was everything that came once the horizon arrived. The land people did not do to the Suun what the Suun had done to them. This is the turn that the nursery story, for all its buried accuracy, could never have predicted, because the broodmothers had made the walkers into monsters, and monsters was the one thing the returning people refused to be. They had spent 9,000 years in the dark becoming the proof that the Suun were wrong about them, wrong that they were screaming beasts, wrong that they could not survive, wrong that they could be safely thrown away and forgotten. And a people who have organized their entire existence around disproving a slander do not, in their moment of triumph, fulfill it. They had not crossed the dark to become the monster of the story. They had crossed it to make the storytellers look at them, truly look, and see not a monster but a people who had been wronged and had endured and had come home. They took the cradle. The worlds were theirs again, the dry continents that had lain empty for 9,000 years since the casting out, the land their kind had been torn from. But they did not empty the warm pools. They did not load the Suun into vessels and fling them into the dark, though they could have, though some among them, carrying 9,000 years of the long grudge, wanted to. What stayed their hand was the one thing the Suun had sent into the dark ahead of the Armada without knowing it would matter, Vessine's song, the broken chord. The land people's scouts had heard it, the Elder-Singer interrupting 9,000 years of unbroken history to tell her own people the truth, to name the crime, to say we cast them out. They are real. We will not pretend they were a myth. No people in 9,000 years had ever admitted what was done to the land people. The victims had assumed, reasonably, that the Suun never would. And then, in the last hour before the horizon arrived, the Suun did not under threat, but freely, a dying woman breaking her civilization's most sacred law to confess a 9,000-year-old sin to people who could no longer be hurt by hearing it acknowledged. That changed everything, because the land people's promise had two clauses and the world remembers only the first, we are going home. But the second clause, the real engine of the 9,000-year patience, was we will make them see what they did. And Vessine, broken-hearted in the deep, had already made the Suun see it before the Armada fired a shot. She had done the land people's deepest work for them. She had turned the lullaby back into a confession. So the people of land and the people of water shared the cradle again, as they had 9,000 years before, not in peace exactly, but in the heavy, exhausted truthfulness that comes after a thing long buried is finally dug up and laid in the open between two peoples too tired to lie about it anymore. The land people built on the dry continents. The Suun kept the seas. And the song of the Suun, which had been broken by Vessine and could never be made unbroken again, healed differently than it had been before, with a new verse added at the place where the old triumphant reckoning song used to be. A verse sung in the slowed-down dead language, so that no Suun child would ever again mistake it for a fable. A verse that told the truth of the casting out and the long dark and the return. And ended not with monsters, but with the oldest and hardest thing a people can sing about themselves. We did a great wrong, and it walked back out of the dark to face us, and we were not destroyed. We were, at last, found out. And in the creche halls of the Suun, beneath the singing lamps, the brood mothers still tell the small ones the old story, the one about the people made of land and breath who were cast into the dark and promised to return. But they tell it differently now. They do not tell it to frighten. They tell it true. And at the end, where the old story said that is the day the walkers return, the new story says something else, something the land people themselves taught the Suun to say. The lesson of 9,000 years compressed at last into a single line a child can carry. Be still, little one, Be honest in the water, for the things a people throws into the dark do not die there, they remember. And one day they come home, and on that day, the only thing that saves you is whether you ever told the truth about what you did. That is the story. It was always the story. The Suun simply spent 9,000 years singing it small enough to sleep through, until the Armada appeared and made them finally awake.